Hi, my name is Gordon Pitts. I'm a writer who was born in Madoc and lives here part of the year. I'm a nonfiction writer with 10 or 15 books under my belt. I write two kinds of books, and I enjoy the fact that they're not very similar. The one book is contemporary books, often with a business theme and often biographical, about people in various regions of Canada who have changed the economy, changed the way we do business. And the others are the ones I do about Madoc area, which are local history. So both of them are a lot of fun, and I'll try to explain why they are so much fun. Now, I've been writing for, all my life, really. And if you want to know how it all started, you have to, right now I'm sitting in the Madoc Public Library, and my writing has a lot to do with this place. I love to read as a boy, and the library and the librarian at that time, a Mrs. Moore, really encouraged me, really fed me great books. And the books I liked were books of adventure, books of adventurers, explorers, soldiers, politicians, maybe sometimes, people who were adventuresome and people who had great stories about their lives and their careers. And I would go home inspired by these books from the library, and I would write. I would write in the back of notebooks that I hadn't finished a math notebook, and there were pages at the end. I would write some prose in there, or more often I would write what you would now call graphic novels, stories of adventurers, which I would put into little comic strips on those workbook pages. And that's probably the first writing I ever did. And I loved it. And I got carried away in a world of my combination of imagination and history, facts of history. Now, as I grew up, went to university, I took history in university, and then I became a school teacher and a history teacher. And I made a big career shift. I decided I wanted to be a writer. And I became a journalist. And what a wonderful thing that was. I was paid to write. And the things I had done as a boy suddenly became, my life, how I made money, how I made my income, how I sustained myself. But more than that, it fed my love of writing and my inspiration. And I graduated from writing news stories for newspapers to writing features, longer pieces. And eventually, about 40 years ago, I took on a book. And it was a book that was very unsuccessful, but it just, it was so much fun to write. It was a book of stories. Actually, it was about Canada and its involvement in Europe, and that started me off. Now, I'm inspired always by people and events, men and women who changed the course of history, or ordinary people who did great things that maybe the world hadn't heard of yet. And I get inspired still by reading other books by other people, whether it's a novel or a piece of history. I love reading about the lives of Churchill and the monumental biography of Lyndon Johnson, 4-volume by Robert Caro. And then in my 20s, I read a book called Caribou Horses, which was a book of poetry. And that really inspired me because Al Purdy, the poet, really epitomized the ability to turn my life and the place I came from, Hastings County, into evocative, exciting poetry, sad poetry about the people who lived in the country north of Belleville and pioneered that area. And many of them ended up leaving because they couldn't make a go of it. But as we know, many of us stayed, and many of our ancestors stayed, and there are still people coming to this area who are inspired, I think, by that poem, The Country North of Belleville. Where do I get my ideas is really an interesting issue, a question I get from time to time. As you can see, I get them from reading other people. I get them from reading newspapers a lot, which are, because I'm a nonfiction writer, the stories in newspapers, I often see them and I say, oh, we could do more with this than just the bare facts. We can tell you something about the people. There could be a great story. I often read something in the newspaper and I say to my wife or my friends, wouldn't that make a book? Could we make a book out of that? And then I get into reading about these things in more depth. And sometimes they are a book. Most of the time they're not. But that's the process a writer continually goes through. Is there a book in this? And I love developing ideas into books. That means even before I start writing a book, I research it. I research it to see if there's more there, more I can draw on. I love researching. It's both a tremendous advantage I have and a tremendous obstacle to finishing books. I love every aspect of researching. I love the background reading of histories of the area I'm looking at. I love newspapers, trolling through newspapers to fill in details, to understand the story. And then I love interviewing people. I think interviewing is the thing I love most about writing a book. And I spend a lot of time doing it, sometimes too much. My wife tells me that one of my bugaboos, one of my challenges is stopping the research and actually writing. I'm having so much fun diving into the research. And I have to set myself deadlines to say, Gordon, quit researching, get off your ass and write this thing. And that's quite an obstacle sometimes. Literary success is something I'm always looking for, but it comes in a very interesting way. Money is good, and I've done well, I think, because people pay me, they commission me to do books. But more than that, literary success means that someone comes up to me afterwards and says, that book, I love that book. That book changed my life. Or, I couldn't stop reading that book. I read it in 2 days or 3 days. One of the reviews of my recent book, which is a kind of a business book, it's a bunch of kids really in the Maritimes who come up with a great technology. Somebody wrote about it in a review, it's a page turner. That is literary success from my point of view, is that people can't wait to get to the next page. And how I do that is challenging. What's the most difficult part of the process of producing something that people will think is a page turner? Well, really, I think it has an awful lot to do with just starting the book. I get a lot of material, I do a lot of research, I do a lot of thinking, and I procrastinate. And so one of my biggest challenges is starting. I think I said that before, stopping the research and starting the book. Here you are with a mass of material that you've taken from various sources. You've got notes. You've taken photocopies. You've been in the Madoc Public Library and you photocopied scads of material and you're just loving it. And then you have to say to yourself, start the thing, start writing. And that often means you've got an outline, but even after the outline, you have to, at some point, you have to plunge in and actually do the writing. And I think for any writer, that's difficult, is to go to that next step of actually writing. And the other thing, as I said before, is when you've written it, stopping it and saying, I've got enough. I should start to think about how I'm going to end this thing that I've lived with for the past 2 or 3 years. So all this is, I enjoy it in a way, but it can be painful. How long does it take me to write a book is often influenced by those things. It can be any length of time. I've written books in a year. I once did what I would call an emergency assignment where someone came to me and said, we fired the other writer and we'd like you to finish the book, and we only got a year to do it. And fortunately, the writer was a person I knew, and he was fine with it, and I was able to take his work and finish it. And so that was just a year. Some of the research had already been done. Might be 3 years to complete the book. Maybe 2 years of research and a year of writing. Or 10 years. I have an idea at the back of my head that I've been working on for 10 years. I often have several ideas that I'm moving forward at the same time. And sometimes it's a bit of a challenge deciding in the morning which idea I should pursue. Sometime I will finish that 10-year project, but meanwhile, I'll probably have shorter-term projects on the go. A writer, I call myself a writer now. I didn't for a long time. I thought it was a little pretentious, a little big of me to call myself a writer, but now I started. And I think writers people could call themselves writers when they set aside time, scheduled time to do their writing. That they build their day to some extent around their writing time. Writing is how they spend their life and how they design their life. And if you're starting to do that, if you're saying, no, I've got an hour in the morning I do writing, or an hour in the afternoon, or just before I go to bed, you're a writer. You don't have to publish anything. You don't have to win any literary awards, but you've become a writer. And you can call yourself that, I think, with some dignity and some credibility. And I love to call myself a writer. Now, in my writing, I practice a craft, I think. I'm a craftsman. It's nonfiction writing I do. So there are certain things that you have to do to make it work. And a nonfiction writer has to be clear in his or her writing. They have to be communicating clearly facts to a reader. They can't get caught up too much in speculation or guessing. Except for certain books. You may find that you need to speculate. But really, clarity is the most important thing, whether you are speculating a bit or whether you are just writing facts. So I think that's a writer. I learned that in newspapers. To be direct, to be clear, and know when to step back and to be metaphorical or to use allusions of some kind. But my primary goal is clarity. And that's very important. The other thing is a sense of place. All good nonfiction writing comes out of a place, an environment. Whether it's the old Hastings Road north of Madoc or a city like New York or Halifax, you have to have a sense of the smells, the scenes, the colors. If you're putting a scene in, for example, a European city, you have to have the smells of walking down that street. And that's a gift to set the reader in the place. When I did my first book, I had a brilliant editor, and his name was Mark de Villiers. He's written a lot of nonfiction. He was editor of Toronto Life magazine for a long time, and he was chosen to edit my first book, and I couldn't have been more lucky. It was about Canada and Canadians doing business in Europe, and it had a lot of sense of place to it. So Mark looked at my first draft of my first chapter, and I was trying to describe what it was like in Brussels, the capital of the European community, and he started to put the red marks, the hated red marks on the pages. He says, you don't have a sense of place. These European bureaucrats that you talk about, what kind of suits did they wear? What were their offices like? What art did they put on the wall? give the reader a sense of the place. You're transporting the reader to a particular place. And I've always tried to do that. And that means, of course, as a writer, you've got to visit the places. That's the fun part of being a writer, is you get to travel. If you're going to be an evocative and a successful writer, you have to put the reader in a certain geographical locality, not just to describe it from a distance, but how it smells, how it feels, what people are wearing. And that's an important lesson for any good writer. As I'm working on a story, of course, the characters come to life for me. And that's often the first thing I start with. But it's a character in a particular, his or her connection to a particular event. So fiction, often it's a plot, but for me it really is the individual and their connection to a place in history and a point of history. That's important. It's meaningful. I have some problems, some challenges that I have to overcome as I'm writing these books. The biggest challenge from a publishing point of view is giving my book away to somebody, to an editor, a distant editor. And that is frightening. It's your baby, and you've gone through it, and you've created it. And suddenly you're giving it up to an editor who is going to possibly tear it apart. Who's going to go to you and is going to say, we have to start all over again on this one. It's a mess. You have to be ready for that. You have to be ready to suppress your ego. And your ego, of course, is vulnerable at that particular stage of the writing process. So I've learned to try to suppress my ego. And I was an editor myself, a newspaper editor. And it's good to have gone through that because you understand the production of a book or an article is a partnership between the editor and the writer. And if you take that point of view, you and your editor become very close, and you can learn an awful lot from good editors, and you can let them guide you into a much better book. The danger is that your ego is going to be trampled on, and you're going to resist this, and you should never resist this unless you have a very strong case. And I've been very successful. I've been very lucky in having great editors who work with me in writing the book and are not in a adversarial role. They're your friends. They are skilled people, skilled craftspeople themselves. I like writing books generally. That's the one issue of publishing that can be most trying. But once I've connected with the editor, things go more smoothly. I think there are parts I really like writing a book. And funny, one of the parts I like writing is not the original draft, but the second draft, my own going through the book and seeing how the parts connect. I've perhaps written a book. I've written a lot of 50,000 words, but then I go through it again and I say, oh, wait a second. This part at the beginning connects with this part near the end. I've got to do something about that. I love doing that, seeing the patterns, almost being a self-editor and making the book flow better. I love writing anecdotes. I like where you bring people to life in a particular part of the book. And these are the things that really make writing a lot of fun. The patterns, the people, anecdotes, the use of anecdotes, how they sustain or improve your thesis, your plot. I love working with anecdotes. And I work at home in my a little office in my home quite a lot. But actually, I've written my books everywhere. I've written parts of them in, winter, and parts of the winter we've spent in Barbados. I write a lot of them in the cottage on Moira Lake. I sit at the table in the sunroom facing the lake, and that is a very important part of my process, is having a place, a view I can look out to that relaxes me, enchants me, helps me think. And often there's music. It's clear that various types of music make me a better writer. One book I wrote to the songs of Frank Sinatra. One book I wrote to the music of Rhonda Vincent, a bluegrass singer. Others I use Emmylou Harris. It calms me, and it really provides an escape. While I have to be focused, it's great to be able to look up and think about, the music that's flowing all around me. It's very inspirational. The other thing I do to be focused is I often take long canoe trips on the lake. And in the middle of the lake, I often come to conclusions about where the book has to go next, what parts of it have to be linked together. So music, a beautiful view, a comfortable chair, and a desk at the right level, and I'm ready to go. Even then, it's hard, and there are some days you're just not ready to do it. The answer to that is I jump in. At 6 o'clock every morning, I turn on the computer, often sometimes at 5:30, and I jump in. I'm clearest in the morning, my mind is best, and I may try to write until about noon. And then I say, give it a rest. My mind is no longer so clear. I'm thinking about other things. I'm thinking about grandchildren. I'm thinking about schedules. But from 6 to noon, I have a fairly blank slate. My mind is clear. And that's something I've done. Actually, I used to do this when I was a writer at the Globe and Mail, or an editor at the Globe and Mail. I would spend about 5 o'clock to 9 o'clock working on the book, and then I'd go into my regular job. And that's become my pattern. 5 or 6 I would start, and I would go right through as long as I could. If I tried to write in the afternoon, I found it was counterproductive. I was tired, I was jumbled, too many ideas. I could do some research in the afternoon, some interviews, but don't try to do any writing. It's self-defeating. Start in, plunge right away. So in a way, that's my modus operandi. And that's the advice I would give to young people who want to become writers. Jump in, dive in. Don't start writing. Even if you don't have a terrific idea where the book is going yet, give it a shot. And if you're young and new to the game, you may find that things flow quite well. You like it. And the other thing is, bounce things off people. I'm always bouncing things off my wife, who's tremendously supportive. Thank God. And I'm always saying, does this sound right? Or does this, in other words, involve other people into your creative process. You can often get some great ideas. I do not treat writing as a solitary kind of assignment. I love to send a sentence or a paragraph to somebody I know. What do you think of this? And when I finish the book, I've often given credit to people that have helped drag me through the process. And I really want to thank them because they've helped me become a much better writer. Don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to try things out. Writing is an experimental process until you end up with something that gives you great joy. Thank you.